Professor of Law, teaches courses on constitutional law, West Virginia constitutional law, and employment discrimination at the law school, and in 2005 received the American Civil Liberties Union of West Virginia Sid Bell Award, and has also been recognized by the West Virginia State Bar with its Public Service Achievement Award in 1999. Al Carlin's biography would take us all night for me to read, so I'll be very brief. Many of you know Al as an eminent plaintiff and civil rights attorney here in town. He is the senior partner in Al Carlin and Associates, and is a graduate of Yale and the University of California at Berkeley Law School, where something I think he's very proud of. On a typical Friday night, his activities included supporting the United Farm Workers by picketing liquor stores that sold Gallo wine. Those of you old enough may remember Gallo wine. I think it still exists now, good wine. And his extracurricular work involved serving as a legal observer at protests, including the student occupation of the University of California Administration Building. He has represented clients in cases involving civil rights, civil liberties, employment discrimination, and personal injuries, and received the Sid Bell Memorial Award from the ACLU in West Virginia for his commitment to civil rights. John Kilwine is the Associate Professor of Political Science and currently the Interim Chair of the Division of Public Administration. He has a BA in Economics and Psychology, a Master's in Public Administration from the University of Pittsburgh. He told me on the way here that he is also the son of Colombian and Italian and German immigrants. He teaches undergraduate courses in public policy, constitutional law, comparative law, and law and politics, and has done significant research on civil legal aid. Who did I skip? Did I skip any? No, I haven't skipped anybody. Okay. Karen Councillor Goldman, as you can see, is a testimonial to the triumph of genetics. She looks a little bit like the man we have just, more than a little bit. But her real claim to fame is not simply that she's William Kunstler's daughter, oldest daughter, and you saw her in the film. Are you still section chief? Yes, she is still the section chief of the New York State Attorney General Charities Bureau. She graduated from Rutgers University Law School, served on the advisory board of NYU's National Center on Philanthropy and Law, along with her husband, Neil Goldman, who's here as well. Served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, has worked as an exchange fellow, Eisenhower Exchange Fellow in Hungary, consulted with government officials and legislative drafters in the Ukraine and China, and was a guest of the People's Republic of China in its International Symposium on Charity Legislation, where she also spoke. And we're very grateful to her for coming such a long distance, and to Neil to be with us. So I think what we'll do is maybe have everybody just make a brief comment about the film, then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up. Does that sound doable? In order, starting with my esteemed colleague, Professor Bass.
Well, Michael insists we be brief, which could be a challenge here. It was, I thought, a powerful and moving film. First, I have just a couple points, however. I'm paraphrasing something that Michael said in his opening remarks, quoting Kunstler, that Kunstler once said something to this effect, that if our bodies are not where there is injustice, then we're growing lazy. And I think we can safely say that no one ever accused Bill Kunstler of being lazy and taking on causes and actually going to places where there was injustice. Another thing I thought was a theme of this person's life was courageousness, that demonstrated in different ways all along that biography. Obviously, he's a heavily decorated war hero, and then he goes and acquires his cushy life in Westchester County and leaves that to take on some pretty scary cases in the South in the civil rights context. It's scary both legally and physically. And then to take on the anti-war cases and persistently take unpopular causes and obviously defend them, those causes very well. And then when you see those frames of him standing up in court and taking on judges, believe me, as a lawyer, I know that would take an incredible amount of courage to do that and to develop the sort of theater strategy that he had in the Chicago 7 case, and to actually defy judges is a very self-assured man, and one who is willing to take a risk. And then, of course, at the end of his life, or near the end of his life, taking on causes that people found unbelievable, and yet he persevered and did what lawyers do, which is provide the best advocacy he could. And I found that to be just a persistent theme. Now, what were his motives all along? Of course, his daughters questioned that, particularly in those later cases. But there was a theme there that I thought sort of framed his life's work. And going through that era, too, I think that his life sort of represented much of what the 60s and 70s and 80s were.
A lot of thoughts. I graduated at the University of California, Berkeley Law School in 1974. And to those of us who were in law school at that time and had politics from liberal to left, and the left went very far left in those days, Bill Kunstler was a role model, something we aspired to. It may be hard for some of the law students here, younger folks, to understand what that meant. And to give you just a brief moment of perspective, I thought I would take off my suit coat and show the law students who are here actually what I actually wore to my law school graduation. This is true. And I pinned the Boycott Gell pin on the associate dean when he handed my meta degree. Bill Kunstler, in that era, was the role model, the person we wanted to be, at least me and my friends from law school. And what I think it really stood for is the thing that the number one thing it meant was that whole metaphor in the film about getting a chance and making the choice to do some things where you stand on the side of justice. And focusing again on the law students here, let me tell you just a brief story that I want to follow up what Bill Councillor taught me with. I belong to an organization called the American College of Trial Lawyers, which has leading defense and plaintiffs' attorneys from throughout the United States. And we had a program that in Washington, D.C., where an attorney from Boston stood up and talked about what he and his son had done to liberate a prisoner in Guantanamo who even the Bush administration identified as improperly arrested and brought to Guantanamo, and how they got him eventually political asylum in Ireland. And as soon as that was over, I walked out, and there was a friend of mine who worked for a major West Virginia defense firm, corporate firm. And he said, Al, that was really terrific. I mean, I wish I could do something meaningful in my law career. I submit to each of you who are here who are looking forward to a law career that there will be a time in your lives where there will be an opportunity to stand up against an injustice. And I hope when you do that, you'll remember Bill Kunstler and not have to ask the question that my friend asked me that day. Because there are in our legal careers opportunities where we can stand on the side of justice and be inside a courtroom and speaking on something that's more than just about our next fee. And don't miss that opportunity. The other thing that I really, and I could talk about this at length, which I'm not supposed to, is the issue that Bill Kunstler talked about in the end when he spoke about all the injustices that were done in the name of the law. And what we as lawyers sometimes forget is that part of what we do in our legal system is legitimize whatever it's doing. And although it's not like it was, I don't think we have as many issues as we had back in the 60s and 70s, But there is no question that there comes times in our legal careers where what is going on and is legal is wrong and morally wrong from our own sense. And the question then becomes, what do we do? Do we legitimize it? Or is there a way we can help our clients address it in the courtroom? Those are very tough questions. They were questions that lawyers struggled over in the 60s and the 70s and sometimes still struggle over today. And there may be times where it is appropriate to stand up in the courtroom and question the legitimacy of what's going on. That's a much longer and more difficult discussion, however, and probably one more for a seminar than a brief comment after a film. Thank you.
Well, this is a special night. First, we saw this excellent movie, and second, that Alan Cardinal can wear a jacket that he wore in college. That's truly amazing. This movie, or I'm an outlier on this panel because I'm not a lawyer. I'm a political scientist, and I was born in 1960. And so, to me, William Kunstler was a kind of a hero as I was becoming politically aware, and I watched the nightly news with my parents and was kind of enthralled by what he did. And so the movie was especially, and as a father also, the movie was especially kind of touching to me to watch these two daughters discover their father. I think at times they were a little tough with him, but to discover their father. The thing is that as a political scientist, before the law school gets them, I try to teach my students that law is politics and that it is all about picking winners and losers. And I think I may end up using this film in my class. I watched this movie twice. I watched it this past week to prepare, and I watched it again, and it was equally good. And I walked away with two sets of feelings. One was positive. I see a man who was consistent, and he's consistent in a way that I've done some work with this concept in the Law and Society movement. We talk about cause lawyers, lawyers who do things that put themselves in danger, lawyers who put their career in jeopardy, their financial status in jeopardy, and sometimes their lives in jeopardy. And clearly William Kunstler was a cause lawyer, and he was throughout his life. But the movie also depressed me, because I wonder what William Kunstler would think about the United States that we live in 2012, and especially when you think about the things that we saw in the film, the status of discrimination, especially housing discrimination, and Mr. Red, who talked about he still has no black and I assume Latino neighborhoods in that Westchester house that he lived in, that William Kunstler helped to facilitate. The state of American prison conditions, how much better are they today? I don't think all that much. And in terms of Native American rights. And then finally, I think that what I think is amazing about the movie is that at the end, and maybe they come to terms with their dad a bit, is that he was proven right. I mean, Attica, the state lies, and the state lied and said that these 9 guards were killed. They weren't killed. They were killed where they weren't killed by the inmates. And in the Central Park jogger case, that mob justice and the common sense and everything else said that these young men were guilty when it was proven that they're not. And so, to me, maybe I'm being silly, but to me, he's a hero, and it kind of confirmed it.
Karen, you want to say something?
I'm extraordinarily proud of my sisters. I think they did a wonderful job in portraying our father and did it with honesty about some of their feelings. And it was hard for them. It was very hard for them. They were kids when he died. They were 16 and 18. And I was 51. So I was an adult, and I had the luxury of knowing him as an adult and having him know my children and go to my children's college graduation. And they never had any of that. And so this was their effort to know him as adults. And the only disagreement I have with them, a lot of the points that I would make have already been said, but the one disagreement I have with them is that somehow he changed, that he was this suburban, ordinary lawyer and then became radicalized. In my experience, he was always a radical. He was always doing things to buck the system. I was always, the 50s, I was constantly being red-baited in our community. So it was clear that he, even before I knew what that meant or what he was doing, it was clear that he was trying to buck the system. And one question that I always get at these Q&As, and this is probably my 50th or 60th time seeing the movie and doing a Q&A, I always get this question about where did this come from? And I don't know what the answer to that is. He was his own person. His parents were pretty conservative, though extraordinarily proud of him. But it came from inside him. He was a unique human being, and what would he think of what's happening today? I think he would be very discouraged, and he would be, I think, a bit disappointed that there don't seem to be any William Kunslers around to do what he did.
Thank you. I'm just going to, by the way, Al, I can do you one better. I spent my law school graduation day in a canoe on the Susquehanna River. But I can't give William Kunstler full credit for that.
One of my classmates carried a cross across the stage, so different time.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one or two questions and then open it up. We've heard enough of me. I have had a question of Karen. I've known Karen for some time, not that well. But I had this question actually even the first time I saw the movie. And I was wondering, of course, it's a big burden or privilege in a way to have a powerful parent, whether it's a man, woman, whatever. And that force is sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes you react against it. Now, you became a lawyer like your father, clearly. So, and yet, well, you've had a very diverse career, too, but clearly a different path in the law than your father, also, of course, in a very different time. So can you say a little about how your father's life and work influenced you as a lawyer?
Well, I think one of the things that he influenced me to do was not to try to follow in his footsteps. I mean, he was an unusual person and had certain skills that I don't feel that I have. But in my personal life, I think he influenced me much more in the kinds of things that I've done and my involvement in the civil rights movement. It was because of him that I went down south and went to a historically black college in my sophomore year, because he came back from Mississippi and he told me these stories, that there were bathrooms that black people couldn't go into, and he couldn't eat with the people he was representing in a restaurant. So I said, I can't believe that, because even though I grew up in a really a time of extreme segregation in our country, and most of my friends' families didn't socialize with people of other races. In my house, that always happened. So I didn't believe him, and I went down south, and then I was in the freedom movement in the South, and then the anti-war movement, and I think he influenced me much more in my personal life. I think he did influence me to become a lawyer, but I knew him well enough to know that he was a hard act to follow. Sarah, on the other hand, is a criminal defense lawyer, and she defends unpopular people and unpopular causes, and she does similar work to that of my father.
I have a question of John, and just one, and then we'll open it up. You're a political scientist, so I'm curious. You were sort of bemoaning the fact of what we have today versus that period, but I wonder, part of the subtitle of this evening was Councillor in a time of Occupy Wall Street. Do you see any parallels or incipient parallels between what's going? Is this an utterly different time
Yeah, because I think that as much as he would have probably railed against them, I think it would have been, it was definitely better to be William Kunstler when there was the Warren Court, when LBJ had a majority in Congress, and things could actually get passed, and things that were passed in you know, he might have said it wasn't enough, but in the direction that he was looking for, you know. And so I did look at your title, and I'm hopeful. I hope that it happens, but the Roberts Court is very different. The Congress is extremely different, and who knows who's going to be in the White House.
I think Al
I agree with what John said, but I don't know that. I mean, there are two things to think about. One is how much room does a lawyer have in the courtroom with the law, and that has to do a lot with what the appellate courts say. But what Bill Councillor was taking on, and what a lot of people were taking on in the 60s and 70s, was causes that weren't necessarily going to be won in the courtrooms. There was no, people didn't know whether they were going to win the Chicago 7 trial in the courtroom or not, or what the appellate courts were going to do. The notion was that this courtroom is an opportunity to educate people about why we're here. And you all should read about the Chicago 7 sometime. It was ludicrous charges brought by the government. It was absolutely crazy.
And the trial was theater.
The trial was turned into theater by the defendants. Maybe a little too much theater at times, but turned into theater by the defendants. And the notion was we use this trial not necessarily because we're going to win it in front of the jury, although we're going to try to do that. We're going to educate the jury about that. That's happened in every one of these trials. But we're going to educate the public. We're going to take it to the public. We're going to tell the story of the history of the abuse of Indian rights in this, Native American rights in this country, of the history of abuse of African Americans in this country, of why the government is acting illegally in Vietnam. And so I think that, you know, if, for example, I hope I'm not wrong, that if there had been, I mean, governments get smarter too. I mean, they didn't arrest hundreds of people in all the Wall Street protests. But if they had tried those tactics, because they learned too, if they had tried those tactics and put the leadership of Occupy Wall Street on trial, I suspect, I have no question in my mind, that there would be people like Bill Kunstler who would be in New York or any city in this country that would take on those trials and take them into the courtroom and use them, if the defendants wanted to, of course, to both try to get the defendants off, but also to raise the political issues that were being raised in the streets. And I think that's the legacy of all the cases that we talked about in the early part of the movie and Bill Kunstler.
I think following up on what Al said was he used the courtroom as theater. His theory about juries was, you know, take the first 12 people, don't go through all this jury selection process. And I think when you saw the Chicago 7 juror, who was a woman who was not initially prone to siding with the Chicago 7, and you see how she was brought around, I think that's a good example of success in using the courtroom the way he did.
I have a last question of Bob and Al, just, and then we'll open it up. And you know, one of the themes of the movie, I think, and of his life, is this disparity between law and justice somehow. And you know, when he gives that litany at the end, legal, 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 legal. And one of the things I've noticed, even before I became a law professor, was in America, for example, we have no law school that has the word justice in its title. We have School of Law, College of Law, something law school, but no justice schools. The only schools in America that have justice in the title are criminal justice programs, and they're usually about sort of punishment to some degree. So I wonder, you know, there is this tension between being an attorney and being an officer of the court, which lawyers are, and the situation that Al has said and Councillor constantly has said of finding that the court, that being an officer of the court is somehow opposed to justice, or that the court itself can be an institution of injustice. So how would you, I mean, as a professor or a practitioner, how do you deal with that, or how does that become a teachable moment in the law school context?
Yeah, well, there's no law school that has justice in the title, and some student said to me once that they had, not necessarily at this school, had taken a constitutional law course and had never heard the word justice, which set me to thinking. I now make sure I say justice a lot in constitutional law. Well, it is a tension. We are officers of the court. We're bound to abide by the rule of law. We're bound to respect the court, which is why that theater was such a dramatic. Well, that's probably not the best word. But his theater tactics were so radical, and because they ran counter to what we normally expect of the behavior of lawyers, and I mean, all I can do is to speak to it on a personal level, and sort of along the lines of what Al said earlier, and that is, one, you have to recognize those injustices, and then two, work in legal ways as a lawyer to try to change them. And that responsibility is not only through bringing lawsuits, which is part of the strategy, but also through writing about it, which I have as a privilege to do as a professor, and of course work with legislatively and speak out. Those are the tools of a citizen, and those are the tools of a lawyer.
Hard question. I think that there are a couple things that I think of in response to that question. One is that you use whatever tools you have, and sometimes you try to push the system, push the envelope a little bit to be able to raise issues perhaps that can't otherwise be raised. You try to educate the court. You try to educate the judge in a case as to what you think, where you think justice lies in this. And, sometimes you can be successful.
Which was like Wounded Knee, and not Wounded Knee, the
subsequent trials.
The subsequent
trials
trial.
Followed the negotiation over Wounded Knee. But the other thing is, though, on some issues you really have to, you're really limited on what you can do in the courtroom, and you have to tell the group or people you're working with that the answer to the particular issue you're dealing with may lie outside the courtroom in the organization and the community. I can remember that one of my first trials, second criminal trial, I represented a woman who was accused of, she had killed her husband, but she was accused of murdering her husband as opposed to self-defense. And it was at a time in the early 80s, and it was probably the first battered woman's murder trial that had been tried in Morgantown, and we took that on by designing a strategy to educate the jury as to what the issues in this. So we weren't just in there to say self-defense. We had experts who would try to explain what it was like to be a battered woman and to answer the questions that people have as to why she didn't leave and all that. So you have to view the courtroom in part as an educational experience. But also in that trial, there was a huge organization of support that arose around her in the community and the courtroom every day. I don't know if every day, but certainly at key points, and particularly at the end, had large numbers of supporters of my client in that courtroom, and they were very much a presence in that courtroom. She was acquitted. It was the right verdict, but it resulted from having a legal strategy that was maybe more than your standard attorney might have taken to the case at the time. So I think you have to find for creative ways to fight it in the courtroom and to organize in the community.
Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? If you'll walk to the microphone so that everybody could hear you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Fetty, and I practice in a little bit down south, but I just had a couple of questions. My first question was what happened between then and now, because I'm almost 40, and so I'm somewhere in the middle between probably Mr. Councillor and y'all and the law students in the crowd. And I have not seen a lot of counselors come along. And as I was watching the movie, one of the things that seemed very interesting to me was how the media coverage of attorneys and what we do has changed, and it seems to me like we don't have as many celebrity lawyers who defend causes as celebrity lawyers who defend celebrities. And I was wondering if there's a way that we can address that particular issue. You mentioned that things might have improved, which I certainly believe has happened. But I know that, for example, when protesters were being cordoned off during protests in many places all over the country, there was not a lot of media coverage of those things that were happening, even though there were hundreds of thousands of protesters turning out and there were people being, shot with rubber bullets in the street. It was interesting to see that the media coverage was so different. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Thanks.
I don't know much about what lawyers were involved in those protests or whether they were legal observers or not. And I really can't answer that. But I think there are bill counselors. Maybe they just don't get the highlights that he did. Maybe there haven't been the specific political trials that thrust an attorney into the public limelight. But if you take Barry Scheck at the Innocence Project, who has spent many past years turning around, along with others who he works with, the public perception of error in our legal system and of the wrongfully convicted. Also, a person I believe was inspired by Bill Kunstler. I don't know the names of the death penalty attorneys. Steve Bright? Mm-hmm. Steve Bright, a death penalty attorney, doesn't get the notoriety, but has spent his life representing unpopular people facing the death penalty. I think around this country there are a number of lawyers who perhaps don't have the notoriety that Bill Kunstler achieved in his lifetime, but who are fighting the good fight, whether it's in environmental law, whether it's in criminal justice, or whether it's in civil rights. The cable news just doesn't pick that up. The cable news is more interested about the latest celebrity divorce or celebrity crime or horrific murder, and much less interested in focusing on those attorneys. But they're out there. Maybe part of the problem is we don't recognize them enough.
If you follow up, think about the cable environment today and think about it when he practiced. And so when those lawyers do those things, especially politically, the cable kind of spectrum is bifurcated so significantly that now you have a cable network that will go unnamed that would be on there and would have experts and would explain why he was wrong, why he was a communist, and would I think shift the debate about what he did. Whereas, again, it wasn't perfect, but at least in his time period, the media, they looked at it and they considered, maybe they didn't consider it evenly, but they considered, both sides to some degree. Whereas now it would be, what's wrong with this? This is, this is how un-American this is, and so on. The other thing to follow up on what Al just said is that there's an interesting study done by two political scientists, Baumgartner and Jones, who show that the work of the Innocence Project and other kinds of things, what effect it's having politically, and that voters, because of those cases, go, whereas they may have supported the death penalty 5 or 10 years ago, when you can show that there are these mistakes and that the system fails, that it's helping to erode, not quickly enough, but it's helping to erode support for the death penalty.
There's a statement, there's no Bill Kunstlers around right now. One of the reasons is that, he was bigger than life. And he had so much charisma and knew how to use it. And of course, he was also a repeat player and became known to the media, and the media liked him because he was entertaining as well as courageous. Those combinations don't come around very often. But I think there are definitely people doing the work.
I'm not officially on the panel, but I would say one thing to segue onto what Bob said. I have some background in psychology, and we talk a lot about narcissistic personalities, and your sisters clearly made the point that he loved publicity, he loved the limelight, and we think of narcissistic personalities as negative, but there's also, in a way, a kind of martyrdom of a narcissistic personality. In other words, you think of, let's say, another one who's been here, Cornel West, the Afro-American scholar, very flamboyant, publicity-seeking, out there all the time, but he also serves a kind of function in bringing energy and attention to what he cares about, and I think, correct me if you think, that Bill Councillor did the same thing. I mean, clearly he enjoyed that. Clearly he had that kind of narcissism, but it served a function.
Yeah, and Liz Fink in the film says, he wanted everyone to love him. He wanted to walk down the street and have people recognize him. And it was to me that he said on the Friday before he died, on a Monday, Labor Day, on Friday he said to me, "Oh, I hope I don't die before Labor Day, because all the first-line stringers will be on vacation and I won't get good press." And it just wasn't totally a joke, because he really he needed that. And in some ways, I think he was an insecure person, and he needed to have that kind of love.
Who's going to put themselves...
Are you raising your hand?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can you either speak loudly or go to the mic?
Yeah, I've got a loud voice.
Okay.
I'm curious, though, about the legal community itself and how it has changed, perhaps over the last couple of decades. It's been a decade and a half, I guess, since Bill Kunstler died. And I've noticed that you were on an ethics committee for one of the association and that. But I'm thinking myself, as we talked about change here, so has there been a pushback and a more conservative pushback, you might say, from the legal community, the ABA in general, perhaps, that has pushed people away from perhaps civil rights law or taking adamant stands or the like? And I guess as a kind of sidebar to that too, I wonder if you're familiar with the pushback perhaps that Bill Kunstler got from the legal community itself during his professional career. What were his colleagues? I mean, I just saw a smatter that, we see scatterings of individuals, but what did the general legal community feel about Bill Kunstler?
Maybe Karen can.
Neil, did you want to say something?
You saw Barry Slotnick, who was probably almost as far to the right as Bill was to the left, who had some kinds of negative things to say about him. They didn't like his techniques. He and I once spoke about this. He was not all that enamored of the law. He was totally committed to his concepts of social justice. And if the law enabled him to achieve social justice, then that's the way he would go about doing it. Also, I mean, he was trained and he was technically very competent. But he was not afraid of judges. Bernie Freed was the judge in the Larry Davis trial, who was a very nice man and a very good judge, who was trying to enforce a Supreme Court ruling, and he took him apart because he didn't care about
You ask a lot of questions. I can't speak for what the legal community thought of him. I mean, I had a kind of bipolar legal history. I went to law school in Berkeley, where I think people thought very highly of him amongst I knew, and then I came to West Virginia, where I think probably not that many people knew who he was, at least in those days. But I read, in preparing for this, I was using lovely Google, and found an article that somebody had written about trying to figure out who the 15 greatest lawyers were of the 20th century. And they had polled lawyers in Arizona, and I forget, they had polled various panels, and Bill Kunstler was on that list. So I think there probably was a recognition that whether one may have disagreed with some of his techniques, nonetheless respected him for what he did. And I think that respect extended to people, many people who probably disagreed with him. But on the other hand, there were people who thought what he did was evil because he delegitimatized the court system. And there's a whole series of issues that go with that. The other thing I'd say is, again, when you talk about Bill Kunstler, why aren't there more Bill Kunstlers? Remember, a lot of what made Bill Kunstler famous, Bill Kunstler was doing a lot of work that was not getting him a lot of fame, you know, in the civil rights movement, personally, in the South. But it was when he came and worked with political movements on political trials that focused on major societal issues that his fame came. And we're not seeing that right now for whatever reasons. I mean, I think if we had on Occupy Wall Street a major indictment, which we're not going to get under the Obama administration, but if we had a major indictment of the leadership of Occupy Wall Street, if there is a leadership, then I suspect there would be lawyers who would rise to the occasion of defending those folks, and then they would get that kind of notoriety. The other thing I would say simply is, in terms of the issue of narcissistic personalities and egocentrism, with all the shit you have to put up if you do that stuff, you have to be crazy or narcissistic, one or the other, to do it, really. So I don't count that against him.
I have a comment and then a question. My comment is that my sense in watching the film was that Bill Kunstler was actually very consistent in his life. So I thought your sisters were a little hard on him, and I can understand why, especially he died when they were young, and that is hard for, and maybe also just the psychology of trying to you're trying to be as neutral as possible, so you're going to be hard. And my sense of his consistency was that he was really about the First Amendment and about dissent, that you have to protect the unpopular, because that's what needs to be protected. And he turned out to be right. A lot of times these people were actually innocent. So I thought he was very consistent. Now, my question is, I have a lot of my jurisprudence students in here, and one thing that will be the theme of the class that I've already sort of set up is this idea between natural law and positivism. And in the United States, we tend to think of the law is what the written law says, or what the judges say, what the legislature says, the written words, and we call that's positivism. That's the school of thought. And then there's another school of thought, which tends to be in thought, people think this is really the right wing has sort of, it's right wing, but as I tell my students, the left wing can be just as much part of this school of thought as natural law, which is that the law really is to reflect justice. But do you think, and I guess I should really direct this mostly to Karen, but if others want to weigh in, do you think that your father was more ascribing to a natural law, or really ascribing to positive law and that it's just illegitimate, and then when it's illegitimate we can be conscientious objectors, or we should debunk the system, or where do you think he was coming from on that jurisprudential question?
I think he was moved by the natural law side of it. But the theater that he had to perform in was governed by the statutory law, judicial decisions. But as Neil said, and that's his son-in-law for how many years? A lot of years, like over 30 years. That he also believed in jury nullification, which would be to, apply the natural law and discard discard the statutes, discard what the judge has instructed you. But one comment about my sisters being hard on him. I don't know how I got through the red baiting. People were hard on me, but somehow I didn't resent my father for it. And what Neil will say is that, to me, my father was God, and so there was, nothing he could do that would be wrong. Got to look at them. They're very young kids, and their fathers representing boys who were accused of this horrendous rape and brutalization of a young woman. He's representing a man who is accused of shooting policemen, and they go to school, and their classmates are saying, your father is representing these terrible people. They're identifying him with his clients. So that they grew up with that. And they also grew up with a certain amount of fear, and especially with the Meyer Kahana case. I mean, that was the only situation where I really felt fearful for his life. So I think that's why they were, hard on him. They were expressing their own feelings and their own difficulties in growing up with a father who was so well known. And when I was growing up, I guess I'm the senior member of this panel, he started his notoriety in the 60s when he started working in the South, and that's when his name was in the newspaper. I graduated from high school in 1961, so I was already out of the house, away in college, and so I didn't have to deal with all of that notoriety. I think that's partially where that's coming from.
I'm just curious, Karen, did your father go on with the college lecture circuit, or do you have any interest in that? It seemed like it would be an active fit.
He absolutely did. Certainly after the Chicago trial, he was in great demand, and he wasn't earning any money from the practice of law. So basically, that's how he earned a living.
He came to my law school.
And he got fees for that, and that's how he supported himself. And I guess by then when he started doing that, I was already married, but he was supporting my mother and my sister. And he loved doing it. He loved being around young people. He fed his ego a lot, and it kept him young. He was 76 when he died, but he never got old. He was always young, and I think that kept him young.
Avi?
Infrastructure on discussion insofar as you look at society and you talk about, particularly today, where financially, economically, you talk about the underdog, people who are falling to the bottom, first place the jobless people, and then those who have jobs, and able to put a meal on the table. To what extent does
John, you're a political scientist. Maybe you have the...
Yeah, I mean, you think about it that, if things, and I'm glad they are, but if things hadn't improved a bit, the unemployment rate's going down, and your original title about the Occupy Wall Street, I mean, think 6 months ago when that was at its height, and it did seem like things were going to get even worse, and imagine, as Al said, that if some of, although there were people who were kicked out of the Occupy camps, but if they'd been done more violently, and if the economy had continued to worsen, and even though those are two wars that were fought by volunteers, that if we hadn't, if we hadn't have gotten out of Iraq, and if we weren't drawing down in Afghanistan, it sounds horrible. I mean, you're wishing for all these things, but if that environment would occur, then one does imagine that they would show up. And there were lawyers. I mean, I saw them interviewed. There were lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild who were defending the Occupy Wall Street folks in New York and in other parts of the country. So, yeah, who knows? I mean, that's looking into the crystal ball. But 6 months ago, it sure looked a lot worse, and it looked like those were the kinds of, that was fertile ground for the kind of same things that we saw in the movie.
And there are a lot of lawyers who volunteered to represent people in Guantanamo. And I can't remember what firm it was, but Neil probably remembers, but some big firm had some of its lawyers representing Guantanamo inmates, and there was a move to get their major corporate clients to go elsewhere, find other lawyers. And I think that was a pretty courageous thing. They didn't back down.
Lawyers don't make political movements. Lawyers represent political movements. Lawyers may sometimes in a courtroom become spokespersons in some ways for political movements. But the movement, we largely, I think, to some extent, react to what's going on in history. Clarence Darrow, some of his most famous cases were representing Big Bill Haywood in the IWW, the Wobblers. I have no question in my mind, like I've said before, that if history brings us to certain junctures where issues start to find themselves into the courtrooms, you'll see those lawyers. But let's not forget the ones who are doing it every day all around the country.
I think the era that Kunstler lived in did produce a series of opportunities for lawyers to become well-known. The 50s with the Red Scare, there were a lot of lawyers made names. Bill Kunstler's partner, Arthur Kanoy, was a pretty famous Red warrior trying to fight the McCarthy era. And during the Civil Rights Movement, there were a lot of lawyers who sort of became well-known from their defense of civil rights workers. And then, of course, during the anti-war era was the same thing. So those were higher-profile eras than what we see at the moment.
There's a question over here, I think.
I think a couple of times I heard people say things are better than they were. I don't think that's true. And I heard Al just now say that if there were things happening that the lawyers would rise to the occasion. Well, things are happening. There's all kinds of financial abuse. There's all kinds of there's many issues. There's the inequality issues. There's the voting issues, money in government. There's plenty of issues. And, of course, I think that the reason we don't have stronger movements, we do have some movement, but is we don't have a free press anymore.
You might be right on that, John. When I say that things are better, I mean, I think we don't see, like if you look, we can have a philosophical argument about this, but if you watched Attica, you watched a black prison with white guards. That's not what you see anymore today. Now, maybe some people would say that's not better. I think it is better. There are a range of things in the courtroom. The judges, when I came to Morgantown, West Virginia, early on, I represented a communist who was raising the red flag on May Day and was busted. And I represented him and got the charges dismissed. And I was like Red Al for a while. You wouldn't see that if I brought that same case today. The lawyers around here nobody would care. I mean, they would think, yeah, that was a good thing you did, Al. There are differences. And the other thing is, yeah, there are a lot of problems today, financial problems, all the ones you discussed. And there are lawyers, I mean, not as many as I would like to see, but, you know, there's Mountain State Justice who deals with all kind of predatory mortgage cases. There are people who do that. But you're not going to see them on cable news because the cable news picks it up when there's, like, movements and courtrooms and heads bashed. They're not going to go do a story on Dan Hedges and the folks who work with him at Mountain State Justice because they need heads bashed to get people to turn to their channels. But that's a longer discussion.
One thing that also occurred to me while we were talking, again, I'm not really on the panel, but I'll just use my power to say one thing, is that the way the media operates has changed so much so that in a way I think certain other professions have usurped the classical function of lawyers, such as filmmakers, for example. You could say that Michael Moore exercises some of the same functions as a documentary filmmaker that a radical lawyer would have been, or the one who did that thing on the financial crisis. I forget who that filmmaker is, but that and I think maybe that historically Kunstler was, in a way, the first real media lawyer, and he knew it. You know, the glasses and the hair, the long hair, the outfits, the ties. He was very aware of that fact, and sometimes the lawyers Al is speaking of maybe have a little less narcissistic personality disorder. They may do similar work, but they're maybe not as aware of the power of all of that stuff as Bill Kunstler was. I don't know. Just a thought. There was a question here, sorry.
Hi, I'm Zachary Kinnaird. I'm a 2L, and if I seem inexperienced or don't say things, please abuse me of my lack of knowledge of history. What I was trying to sort out in my mind, I guess, was the distinction that y'all were discussing with the increased problems with the financial system as opposed to maybe a stereotypical way of saying social justice, maybe for race and gender and things like that. And I've been pigeonholing them sort of in a civil court versus a criminal court. Many of the landmark cases that I hear about, even before I came to law school, Brown v. Board of Education, Miranda, all of those, and a lot of those had very, let's say, racial undertones. Whereas today, trying to link this to the Occupy movement, a lot of it has to do with wealth inequality and financial corruption and stuff like that. My question is there any advice, or first of all, for translating some of the skills we could use, but more particularly for the lessons that we learned from Bill Kunstler? Is that style still applicable for lawyers who might be trying to pursue change in maybe a civil realm to try to fix maybe a systemic problem as opposed to maybe the after effects of it, if that makes any sense? Thank you.
Bob and Al, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you asked, there are a lot of things, ideas in your question. I don't know that I would advocate adopting Bill Kunstler's style. What?
Theatrics, particularly in the courtroom.
Theatrics in the courtroom is a case. You've got to know your judge. You've got to know your jury. You've got to know whether the press is there, because if you're trying to use the courtroom to get on a message, theatrics don't much matter if there's not a camera or at least reporters there. I think the lesson of Bill Kunstler, I was very positive on things being better. There is a way they're not better. I think there are fewer law students coming out of our law schools today that are looking to do those kinds of things than there were when I was a law student. I think there are fewer. And I think the lesson that I would take to law schools, to law students from the life of Bill Kunstler is not necessarily the theatrics, although there's some of that. I mean, one gets into a whole discussion of how you do a trial to raise political issues. That's something that was often talked about in the 60s, the 70s, and we can have a long discussion on that. But I think the lesson, really, the lesson of Bill Kunstler is the theme of the movie, that if you get a chance in your life to do something that makes a difference as a lawyer, don't walk away from it. Because you may not, unless you're going to be a cause lawyer, and most folks aren't. But you're still going to get a chance in your legal career, once, twice, 3 times, I don't know how many times, to take a case that makes a difference. And the lesson of Bill Kunstler and what you should take away from this film, if nothing else, is that David analogy, and to take up that stone. I think it's the most rewarding thing a lawyer can do. Whether it's another example of where lawyers, there are lawyers, you don't know most of their names, who stood up on behalf of Muslims and Arabs in the post 9/11 mania, in which a lot of wrong was done. Lawyers had a chance. Sometimes lawyers, the Guantanamo lawyers, from, as Karen was saying, from very straight corporate law firms.
Some from within the military.
Within the military, there was a guy, I don't know if you saw it, a JAG officer on Guantanamo, who was drummed out of the military because you have to get promoted, as I understand it, every so many years. And he was one of the voices for the Guantanamo defendants. And there's some reason to believe that that was the reason that he wasn't promoted and he was out. But my suspicion is he feels very proud of that. So if those chances come in your life, take them.
It occurs to me that Karen and Neil have been en route since about 8 o'clock this morning, probably. So we should just have a couple more questions and give them a meal at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to, yes.
Yeah.
But I just wanted, I know I'm not on the panel, but my response to that, and just say that I'll take my prerogative here. And also say, I think one of the differences, though, is that what Kunstler was doing was attacking government. And what reminds me of that is my mother, I grew up, and we were told to be afraid of the government. I mean, my mother's family, because they were musicians, were looked into. Okay? The first thing were communists. My mother, is a big Fox News fan right now. Okay? But I was told, do not ever sign a petition at all. Government will get you. Okay? And what he did was he took on, the David taking on the Goliath of the government. It is very unpopular, especially now where we're more conservative. Countries are more conservative to take on the coercive power of not the state, the government, but the coercive power of private enterprise. Because you're a communist if you do that. Anything left of free market is communism, which of course it's not. And I think that's part of what's going on here is that it's unpopular. So you have, it goes back to your point about the free press. The press is owned by what? It's owned by private enterprise. And it will not attack itself. And the Occupy the Wall Street is about attacking free enterprise.
Can I just say that I think that actually one of the most remarkable things about Arthur Cohen, I don't know if he's of your fathers, but I was surprised sometimes because I don't ever hear much about the National Lawyers Guild anymore. And I used to belong to that, and I know where I went. But it's interesting to me that you don't sometimes turn to some of those more left-wing groups because we might have groups to the left, but that message about people over corporations is a message that Dr. Cohen was talking about, I don't know, 7 years ago, and that is a message that's only now starting to kind of trickle down. And the amazing thing about Occupy Wall Street is to have actual human beings talking about corporations. To actually have that happen in my lifetime, when I think so much of what we see is just sort of pro-capitalism, labor rightly definitions. It's an amazing thing. So it's phenomenal.
I also think that the words redistribution of wealth, are totally anathema to be spoken in the United States by a politician. And Occupy Wall Street was the first time I even heard those words about wealth distribution and wealth which immediately says communism to most people, I think.
It's really important to remember that Occupy Wall Street, Occupy movement, Airspring, many of the movements that have been extremely powerful and popular have because of, not because of media, traditional media, has become relatively irrelevant, but their power comes from the fact that, this is me, and everyone in this
post-tweeting William Kunstler's of the world. I want to thank our panel, who all have day jobs, for being so generous, and all of you for coming. I'm sure they'll be willing to talk. Thank you so much.